I think, the underlying premise of everything that we've put together in this conference is the need to do different and new things. It may very well be that we're in a period of experimentation, and we don't have a kind of congealed model that, if one exists, that we would all fall behind. But we recognize that for the labor movement to renew itself, it has to change. And so I think there might be like a 7-step process to recognizing that and actually doing change. The first one is denial. I think we're past that. But the second step is, that's what we've always done. And so I'd like each of you, if you want, to address why the work that you're now doing between labor and community isn't what the labor movement has always done, and how that's different.
Great question. In the case of bargaining for the common good, I think there are 3 things I would emphasize about what make it different. The first is the kinds of ways in which it draws labor and community organizations together to work together. That what we're striving for here, what the people who are putting this together are striving for, is a true partnership, not a situation where labor defines what it needs in a contract negotiation, then recruits community partners to support it, and that's a very transactional relationship. But rather, in this case, that from step 1, the whole process of deciding what labor wants is a process that involves the community, and that the community partners and unions approach this together in a partnership. And when we planned that conference in May, we had representatives of Jobs with Justice, of all the major community organization networks, as well as the unions, and the community organizers as well as the union representatives helped to plan this. So first, I would say it's the partnership and trying to make it a true partnership of equality. The second thing that makes it different, I think, is the way we're approaching the question of bargaining and what is it our role to bargain over. And in the sheet that maybe you've gotten your hands on now, we're trying to encourage people to bargain over things that aren't even permissible sometimes legally to bargain over some of the financial deals that their government entities that they're bargaining with are involved in, to bargain over labor standards in the community that are not just affecting the public sector worker. They bargain over things like teachers bargaining over schools to jails pipeline issues, decriminalizing youth in the community, or expanding after-school programs. To put on the table issues that are common good issues, and to use the bargaining process as ways of highlighting those issues. And in some cases to do that even in situations where the law says, well, you can't do that. Chicago teachers a couple of years ago in that campaign that we all admired so much, they put on the table a number of issues in the course of their bargaining that were really not their business as the law sees it. But nobody tried to take an unfair labor practice charge against that. Nobody tried to say, you can't raise these kinds of issues because it would have looked so bad. So we are trying to think about bargaining in a new, more expansive way that brings especially the financial industry into this, because they are really the powers that be in a lot of these communities, and unless we can politicize them, we can't really bargain effectively. And I think the third thing that makes this different is the way it's unfolding and being carried forward. It's been supported by the national unions. They helped support our conference in May, but it's really being carried forward at the local level. And for us to accomplish this change in the way we approach bargaining, that's a local level fight. And that will change from community to community as different partners define what is most appropriate from the common good perspective in their communities. So this is not a top-down movement in any way, but it's rather a kind of networked effort. So I would say those are the three things that are different from this perspective.
Thanks. So I agree. I think partnerships are a key difference in our work too, and Joe said a lot of it, so I won't repeat it. But I think that the other thing that is really different today than from the past is a real exploration and focus on new forms of organization and organizing approaches of workers in the broadest sense. So both, union and non-union workers. And that requires a very different kind of approach and thinking around how we build for the long haul. And within that are tremendous dynamics. So just to say, there's an array of worker organizations who do not have collective bargaining rights, or who have not been covered under basic protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Many of them are worker centers, domestic workers, farm workers, a broad range, restaurant workers, guest workers, many who are doing very different, innovative organizing on the ground at a much smaller scale because of their size and scope. That's a huge proposition to say to unions, what can you learn from this, what's sometimes referred to as sort of scrappy organizing, right, models? But how do you learn from what is actually happening in these spaces? And what can we learn together that helps us think about and forge new pathways forward? So I think the fact that that requires lots of honest conversation and negotiation of power. There are tremendous power dynamics in that. And just to name it, most of the worker center organizations are run by people of color, and they're young. And there's tremendous dynamics in all of that. People want to just add a little oomph into the space, right? There's a lot of dynamics in that. So what has to be different is, what does it mean to be around a table with people who look and act and have different cultures? That is a huge barrier, can be a huge barrier, but if we do it right, can be a huge opportunity in how we in fact expand our notion of what's possible today in this work. I also think that I want to repeat what I said in the earlier round of no longer thinking about Labor Community Alliance work being about how we garner community support for workplace fights. We're going to lose if we keep thinking that's the way. And I've been to my share of this campaign solidarity meeting, and we've been there for all the fights. We have been there. We aren't going to win if we have that continued approach. We have to be thinking, we're in a moment now where we have to figure out how workplace fights are part of the broader community struggles. That's why the Fight for 15 is so powerful. It's also true that the Fight for 15 didn't just come out of nowhere. That came out of multiple organizations on the ground saying, you know what, we need to raise wages in this country for low-wage workers, and we need to raise wages way beyond what people think are politically viable if we're going to inspire people to take risks and take action right now in this climate. That's why the fight around Walmart is so heartening at this moment. That campaign is a great example of what does it mean when you have workers of one of the largest employers in the country, let alone globally, who are willing to stand up and actually redefine who is considered a Walmart worker. It's not just the retail workers, it's the warehouse workers, it's the logistics workers, it's the workers who produce the products that are sold at Walmart. How to have an expansive view in this moment means that it requires us to think about labor community building in a very, very different way. And it's through those kinds of collaborations that new demands can be developed and new wins can be achieved. So I'm sure, I know Dan is going to talk on the next panel, but I'm sure when the Walmart campaign started, There was no notion that we were going to have a big fight around pregnancy accommodation at Walmart, that we were going to involve hundreds of grassroots women's organizations coming together and this really creative Respect the Bump campaign to win pregnancy accommodation for these workers. But we did, and we proved that we could win something from Walmart, right? But that's, like, in this moment, we have to think about labor community alliance building in a really expansive way, in a very different way that actually tips, like, really digs into the creativity, but also has a real hearts and minds strategy to get the public behind the demands that we know are not just the demands of a small set of workers, but are actually the demands of growing numbers of people today. So I think there's a lot there, and we can keep adding on, but I want to be respectful of time and hand it off to Jerry.
So I think at the heart of this, for me, what makes this different is, again, it's the partnerships. They're strategic partnerships. They're not transactional partnerships. They're not, you come join us. They have reciprocity.
That's right.
At the core, right? I'm not just gonna ask you to come to my struggles. I'm gonna come to yours. And when I'm thinking about how I want to talk about my work, I'm going to do it with you, right? Which is very, very different than historically we've done our work. You can see the products of that in a variety of different things that we've done. We are intimately involved with worker centers. We've been intimately involved with them for a while. I'll say here that the Fight for 15 didn't come from us, right? Let's be clear. I'm clear where we get what we get, right? It comes from a conversation that involved community, worker centers, and traditional unions in a conversation about how to raise wages for workers, right? That's a very different kind of conversation. How we had that conversation is different. What we demand of ourselves in it is different. I think, and it will give rise to a bunch of things off to the side that are going to be incredibly different in how we do politics together. So, again, I think it's reciprocity, it's strategic partnerships rather than transactional ones, and it is in some ways forcing all of us to see something which some of us always knew, which is there is no way to get to a powerful economic justice movement that does not involve bringing in social justice issues. We represent a very different kind of way of thinking about economic justice. Economic justice and social justice are inextricably bound. You will never get to a powerful workers' movement that ignores women, that ignores people of color, that ignores environmentalists. You just won't get there. And so from our point of view is that whole broader set of folks are involved in a conversation about how best to achieve its shared goals together.
So I think the right does a really good job on messaging when it comes to communities of folks who identify as conservative with right to work. That was a genius phrase. We all hate right to work, but it was pretty smart on their part. And other phrases that the right thinks of first. So I think within USAS, we've been pretty successful within our coalition building, both nationally and locally and on campus, because we think about the mushy middle folks is what we like to call it. So the everyday student who's not already radicalized and politicized, and how we can most reach them within our messaging. And that's been really, really, really beneficial to us in a lot of our campaigns. Specifically, to give an example again of the Tennessee Living Wage campaign, not only are we campaigning alongside the workers for a living wage, but we also have a demand to raise wages, not tuition, because students who are everyday students, once again, who haven't had the opportunity like me, fortunately, to be politicized and to really understand how unions and the labor movement's really, really beneficial. An everyday student's not going to just answer to typical radical messaging. So it's really important for labor in general, student organizations, community organizations, and unions to think about how to message it better, that people in certain communities will be able to lean into the message better. And then also I think we've been pretty successful with our new campaign work and coalition building, because we've been really creative and tried to think about what are some of the causes and roots of why student situations are the way they are on campus right now. So the Teach for America campaign is so exciting because folks who are impacted by the privatization of education, charter schools, standardized testing, that follows people up to the college level. So we've really been able to think about, well, what are the causes of some things before we, get to our campus organizing. So we've been creative with our campus organizing the last couple of years, especially in Minnesota as well. Wells Fargo had a big relationship with a lot of colleges on campus. So not only did we think about like the foreclosures that were happening within the community, but we also took that campus piece. So whenever we're running a campaign, we always stop and think, how can that message in this, and this community? And if we're speaking to different people, different communities, how can we tweak that messaging? So we're not only reaching our membership base that we know are already believers of what we're trying to fight for, but we're also reaching those other folks in other communities, because all of us in this room right now could sit and talk about things all day, but if we don't reach those people who don't have that access to it and aren't politicized already, then it'll mean nothing.
So the problem with going last is that everyone basically said everything that's in my notes. So I'm going to say something else. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to build labor community alliances and why it's important to us. So this year, Working Washington is sort of relaunching into a much more independent organization. We are looking at how we actually build an organization base, how we organize workers without having a union, and how we diversify funding sources. And so I sat down with an organizing director of a local union a couple days ago, and she said, I'm not sure Seattle can actually handle another community or labor organization, but if anyone's earned the right to try, it's you. So try we will. Okay, so here's what we're doing. I think there's a few different components. I'm going to be really concrete about what we're doing. So one, we're launching a number of new programs this year. One, we are bringing in people from different labor unions, community organizations to actually run our morning meetings and trainings with our organizers, because we know that issues such as immigration matter a lot to the workers that we are mobilizing. And so instead of learning about this and doing this ourselves, we are bringing in other organizations to run trainings for our organizing staff and to run trainings in our OC meetings with our workers. We are also, once we find out that there are issues happening in workplaces, so for example, we had a really great Wendy's where we had a number of workers who were immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and once the manager got wind that they were organizing, all of a sudden ICE was called on them, right? No surprise. So we actually brought in our immigrant rights community organization to come, and we had them actually, we actually asked our workers to go talk to them and start building some of those bridges. We also have organizations come in and do presentations, so we are not territorial about our lists. If Rock United, for example, comes in to our organizing committee meetings and runs surveys of our workers. We are running a number of other programs as well, so we are actually staffing our organizers to other labor unions campaigns and other community organizations campaigns. We send them out for periods of a week or 2 weeks to run blitzes so that they can get trained on how to do things like other organizations do, because we don't do them that well. And we're launching a program this year where we have hopefully commitments of roughly half a dozen organizations to give us organizers for between 1 and 6 months to come and work on our campaigns. Some other really concrete things that we're doing is we have started sitting down with community organizations and labor organizations and actually building out campaign plans together. So we lay out what our focus is this year, and we build out how we're gonna win, how we're gonna get to those wins together, and how we're gonna turf it out, and what priorities we wanna do jointly. And then there's this other thing that happens too, right? So I think a lot of people talked about this. I had a pretty senior level organizer from a union, I'm not gonna say which union, say to me, so this post-Ferguson stuff is really exciting, right? How do we get those people to just come to our actions? Like, do we just go and fire them? Which I think we all know isn't really the right answer, right? So what we've started doing is we have organizers and workers that are now staffed to planning committees for things, and the purpose isn't for us to get a worker to actually be a speaker at an event. The purpose is actually because we care about these things. We ran surveys of our workers last year on issues that matter to them, and obviously wages was number one, but social justice issues mattered a lot to them as well. And so now we've started forming committees of our organizing committee campaigns, and from those committees we started asking people, do you want to be on the MLK Celebration Planning Committee? Great, you should go do that thing, right? And so we've started actually embedding ourselves into other organizations because it matters to our workers, because things other than just wages matter to our workers as well.
So I think Jerry's point that Community Labor Alliance and social justice work on the part of unions are inextricably linked is an important point. And it brings us, I think, to discuss some of the difficulties in actually implementing that. And it's not always the case that that the only thing that stands in the way of unions and social justice work is union leadership that doesn't appreciate its importance. There are issues of the union being able to bring its rank and file along. And it's certainly the case, just by way of illustration, that although AFT, AFSCME, and SEIU were certainly out in front around the Ferguson demonstrations and the demonstrations around Eric Garner. And while all three unions and their locals, particularly in places like New York, stood fast, it's also the case that there were significant but minority strains within their membership that pushed back very hard against the union's social justice stance in this regard. And some of it may even also be people saying, look, we feel like we have diminishing power and diminishing influence, so why are we going off on these broader issues when we can't even, deal with the issues that, in their view, are at the core of the union. So I think to have a really honest discussion of that, we really need to go into some of these difficulties and some of these challenges. And I just wonder if anybody would like to comment on that.
So I just, it has been enormously difficult inside of SEIU to get our whole board behind a stance like the one we took in both New York and in Ferguson. In order to do it, however, you've got to be willing to open up a very different kind of conversation inside of your own union. So we really actually brought our correction officers into the conversation with the rest of our members about what we were doing in Ferguson and in New York, and to some extent we were in Florida before that, and before that we were in LA and a bunch of other places. It touched off probably one of the most interesting conversations I've engaged in a long, long while. One, the correction officers and the police union, we have NAGE inside of us and we have correction officers inside of us, were forced to listen to their own co-workers in some ways. I mean, fellow union people tell them how policing happens in their community and how they in some ways feel about it, and tell them about their own kind of political posture. As well as our own members who feel that way, having to listen to some correction officers. It was some of the most complicated, difficult conversations that we've ever had. On the other hand, our police union inside of us came out and supported what we did in New York and what we did in Ferguson. I think we can get to a different place, but it requires a different kind of conversation. You've got to know that what has produced the kind of crazy Republican politics in our country that has been hegemonic at the national level for many years is developed by the South bolting and some part of the North bolting around civil rights. We can't get to a politics that works for the country unless we're willing to own a conversation about race inside of our own movement. Right? And so, for me, it requires that you get into an ugly conversation that has some part of our public workers saying, why do you think support for a fight against voter suppression is a union issue, right? Can't we do something else? And I'm like, we now have to have that argument, because if in fact if we allow the voter suppression to happen in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in blah, 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 what do you think is likely to happen? A whole lot of right-wingers who attack the labor movement will result. In which case, if you want to be strong enough to push it back, you had better look at what's happening to the black vote, the brown vote in the country. That, for a whole lot of our white workers, is a hard thing to swallow. But I think it's easy to demonstrate that, in fact, that kind of politics that goes after black and brown workers also have over time hurt white workers as well. And that you got to, in some ways, in that kind of politics in order to get to a different place. I don't say that's an easy conversation to have, but it is a conversation that I think is essential. I think white workers have got to own that unless, in fact, you can figure out a way to empower black and brown folks in this society, that workers are in trouble. That's a vision that Martin Luther King understood very well, right? It's a vision that Randolph understood very well. And so, you know, I say it's hard. There's a whole lot that says, well, this is narrowly about a workplace issue, but I'm like, it ain't narrowly about a workplace issue. And if you narrow it to that, you're gonna lose that, because all of your allies are gonna get killed along the way and then weaken yourself.
I would say that there is a parallel to what Jerry's talking about there, and the need to widen the sense of what is labor's self-interest, what is labor's interest, which is basically what he's arguing for, is seeing that interest is very broad and it's not narrow. And there will be a tension in the bargaining for the common good effort that's underway, certainly around those very things. And the folks who are thinking this through are conscious of that. That is that the temptation will be that when a strong community labor coalition comes together in a particular bargaining setting, that the employer will come to the table with basically giving the union what they want. And it will be a tempting thing for the union to say, well, unless our partners also get what they want, this is not what we want. And that labor will have to define its bottom line differently in some of these ways. And this is a parallel, I think, to what Jerry's talking about. If we're going to build the community of interest that we need to really revive the labor movement, labor can't allow the bargaining process to force itself into a box and to say that what determines whether this was good or bad is, did we get X % wage increase? We have to look at what our community partners are getting, and we have to see our interests tied up with theirs.
You shouldn't feel compelled, but if you'd like to
Okay.
comment.
Yeah, I just want to add something. Within USAS, we've been thinking about the labor movement and our organization's political education. So I think political education, as you mentioned earlier, is super, super important. But USAS takes a couple of days just to do collective liberation retreats. And we take a couple of days before we even start talking to our membership to have our national leaders come and talk amongst each other about how we're going to frame everything. And something we've really been working on, which I don't think the labor movement does enough, is thinking about trans folks, or within the Black Lives Matter movement, Black women's lives mattering as well, and Black trans folks. So I think in order for us to really start moving forward in the labor movement, we need to take a look at us internally and look at us as organizers first, and to make sure that our collective liberation is on point before we move on to our membership, because there's a lot of folks that are also being left out within a lot of movements that are happening. And it's really exciting to see labor co-sponsoring Black Lives Matter and other movements, but we definitely owe it to other folks of marginalized communities to take it even further than that. So figuring out that internal messaging and issues first is definitely a big part of USAS's success in the recent months.
So, one last question that kind of takes us back in history a little bit. And I think one of the kind of interesting moments in the history of American labor and American civil rights movements was after the 1963 March on Washington, when a group of people that included A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and Michael Harrington and others developed a freedom budget, the premise of which was that that simply ending Jim Crow was insufficient for African American emancipation, and that what you needed was a broad, if you want, social democratic agenda that addressed conditions in education and health care and across the board. And for various reasons that we don't need to go into today, that moment was lost. But my question to you is that I think all of this conversation around labor and community is in some way trying to figure out how we recreate that moment in our time, because we know programmatically that for both the renewal of labor and for conditions for Black and brown folk and so on, we know that the only way forward is something like that. And so it may be unfair to ask you this question, but I will ask it nonetheless, which is, how could you conceive of the work you do leading in some way to another moment like that, where social justice and labor comes together politically and programmatically with a chance of really making some fundamental change in this country?
I would say first, in your question, Leo, as it's broadly framed about history and moments of history and taking advantage of those moments, that we have to be modest, I think, and say that we don't really have the ability to totally shape history and create moments. But what we have to be able to do is be prepared to respond to the moments that are being created. And I think one thing we can say about this particular moment in our history and in the history of, let's call it global capitalism, is that some very severe, what could be called contradictions are emerging. The growth of this enormous degree of inequality that is in the consciousness now of everybody, just about, is starting to create some opportunities for discussion that weren't there. The racial conflicts that we've seen coming out of and the struggles for racial justice out of Ferguson and the aftermath of that in the U.S., that's creating a moment of opportunity as well. And that there are things that are happening, I think, that are creating an opportunity for us to engage together in a movement to take advantage of this moment. And I appreciate what David Rolfe said earlier this morning, is I don't think we know what the model is yet of how the next movement will actually unfold. But I think that bits and pieces of it are visible in lots of different ways. I think bargaining for the common good that I've spoken about today is just one element of some of that. And in addition to the parts that I've laid out to you that I've already discussed, I would add one more element to it, and that is it's a way to try to inject a moral argument into where we are now. And by talking about the common good, we're really trying to, you know, that word good is a thing that refers to what is moral, what is right. And this is what we have to try to raise to the surface now and shape in ways that serve the movements that all of you are involved in, is that ultimately this is a moral intervention. And it has to have programmatic, it has to have concrete manifestations, but we need to reclaim a powerful moral language. So that's part of, I think, what this moment's about.
So I want to offer that I think there's a lot of moments for us that are coming up, and we're in the midst of many of them because of the reality of our political system and our economy. And I think that the reality is every movement ends up facing forks in the road or choices at any given time. We can do A or we can do B. We can follow this path or that path. This path will get us a win quickly. This path will take time, but we'll build for the long haul. And I think the point that we're at as a labor movement is we have to stop choosing the quick victory and we have to start investing in the long haul. What is the social infrastructure we are building together? What are the values of this nation? How are we reclaiming the values of the majority? How are we shaping and articulating the values of the majority? It is incredible to me. Like I think about when we came up and developed the Caring Across Generations campaign, that wasn't out of nowhere. It was actually looking at demographic shifts in our country. A person turning 65 every 8 seconds is not a small thing. The fact that people are living longer lives, that people will choose to age in place in their homes, that could be a crisis that we fail to actually do something about, or it could be a crisis that creates a whole new system and structure that speaks to the values of who we are as people, as our humanity, reclaiming our humanity. And, you know, I look at the growth of contingent workforce, the migration of workers ain't ending anytime soon. It's gonna grow. Or I look at, you know, and so I think as labor movement and as a broader labor movement relationship to broader social justice organizations and movements, we actually have a responsibility to think about the long term and think about what we're laying in place for the long haul. And I get really worried, like, yes, I'm gonna use the example of this moment we're in with this women's economic agenda. It's a huge opportunity. But boy, will we blow it if it starts and ends with paid sick days and family leave. And I'm all for paid sick days and family leave, let me be clear. But boy, another missed opportunity to reshape what it's really gonna take to give women economic power in this country. So for me, I feel compelled in these moments to kind of shake us up and say, if it's not going to be us in this room, then who the hell is going to do it? Like people, millions of people are looking to us. Take responsibility, own the power that we have to make better choices that not only benefit the labor movement, but benefit our society as a whole. I want to be part of a movement that is about reclaiming our humanity, that is about reshaping our values. And I think we're here. We're here. Today, every day, we have to make those choices.
I think we exist at the intersection of 2 to 3 deep crises. There's a deep economic crisis, right? You saw it, I mean, Obama came to office right in the middle of it. it's unresolved, right? Trying to figure out how we organize folks against this politics of inequality that undergirds that economic crisis is, I think, an essential part of what we need to do. There's another crisis. It's a social crisis, right? I mean, people of color live in economically marginalized, oppressed situations. Something's gonna give there. You feel it. You feel it when you look at the response to Ferguson. But it goes much broader than that, right? And so if you can't figure out a way to bring folks who care about deepening inequality together with folks who care about social inequality, together with folks who care about this other big crisis that's looming on the horizon. It's called the environmental crisis.
That's right.
It's a real big one, right? Real big one. Can't figure out what you do going forward unless you figure out what to do about it. And some of the energies and all of the other things that we're talking about are absolutely essential to resolving it as well. I think we're at the intersection of those three crises. Building movements that in some ways tries to address them is essential to the moment. The labor movement won't get rebuilt unless it's in that context, right? The environmental movement will continue to fail unless it's in that context, right? And I would say Black lives will only matter in the context of a larger conversation about how all of our lives have been cheapened. All of our lives. And what it takes to build back the power of working people to live better lives. So, that's me.
Of course, I'm biased about young people working with 19 sweatshops, but really, it goes back to young people and young people being at the table of this new organizing, this opportunity we have. We have an opportunity to politically educate a big group of folks in a new generation that doesn't understand how a union could be helpful, that needs to understand more about the labor movement, what's at risk. So USAS can do that at our 150 campuses, but we definitely can't do that alone. What we need is our community partners, our labor partners to also realize that and realize the value of working with students on campus. So it's really, really important for students to be at the table. So I encourage you all to continue to work with us with campaigns as well as funneling students into the labor movement is super important. That's one of USAS's second goals after union density is to get people into labor. So as you leave this event today, definitely encourage you to think about what part should young people play and invite us to the table to talk about what part we should play, because there's nothing worse than feeling tokenized and just assisting the labor movement. We want to be part of the labor movement. So.
So I came back from a really, really long vacation last week because I am benefited by a union contract, so I get vacation. Yeah, that's awesome.
It's awesome, isn't it?
It was amazing. It was amazing. I got to go to South America and see a bunch of really cool revolutionary things. So I come back and I'm catching up on my emails, and I have 4 articles that I read in a row. The first 2 are an article by former Senator Webb, which I think people probably know, talks a lot about white low-income workers and what we can do to support that, right? And a Pew study that that combined sort of suggests that if we are short-sighted, we go after, as a labor movement, go after economic issues and don't worry about the social issues, because that's how we win in the short run, right? And that really concerns me because of all the reasons that people have talked about before, right? And so I think that maybe it's just because I'm coming back, but I think that like some of the framing around the minimum wage victories last year and what candidates need to do and talk about to win next year is really going to pigeonhole some of the labor movement. And so I would caution that people need to really be thinking about how these things sort of combine with each other. The third article was really interesting. It is about people who had nailed themselves onto crosses in Paraguay demanding back pay. I don't know if folks read about this or not. And someone sent this article to me and said, hey, how about this for our next action, right? I'm a pretty good organizer, but I don't think I'm that good. But I think what that actually speaks to, right, very religious country, things that maybe work and are a little bit shocking is that we need to be really into experimenting and okay with not having a really well fleshed out plan to go out and do things. If workers bring ideas, if you're like too much, one of our best actions that we did was with someone who had been with us for 2 months, who suggested that we do a 15-mile march between SeaTac and Seattle after the SeaTac win, leading into the Seattle win. So experimenting with things that maybe aren't fully like researched out, I think we need to do. And the fourth article was about Wet Seal, which I wrote about a little bit in the Prospect article. But folks heard about the workers at Wet Seal last week, right? Does anyone know what happened to them? Because I don't. And I think that's the problem, right? Is that as organizers, we go in, and sometimes it takes a lot of organizing to get workers to do something like come out on strike or to like stand up to their bosses. And these workers, to the best of my knowledge, after talking to a bunch of reporters, didn't have an organizer come out and do that. They did this on their own, right? And as a labor movement and as community organizations, when workers are standing up, when people are standing up, we need to be there to support them in a number of different ways. And that's how I think we need to like support some of that grassroots stuff that's already happening.
Okay, I'd like to thank a really fine panel that made my job very easy. And I'm sure you found very enlightening. We're back here at 2:45 for the next panel.